To understand the current regulatory physics of the European pharmaceutical market, we are going to isolate a single, highly active dataset, the June 22nd to 25th, 2026 meeting of the European Medicines Agency's Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use. On paper, the committee's output looks like standard bureaucratic volume: 6 new medicines recommended for approval, granted 12 therapeutic extensions, issued 3 negative opinions, and executed 1 total market revocation. But these aggregate numbers mask a strictly bifurcated environment. We are seeing a system where legacy treatments and familiar mechanisms of action flow through with high efficiency, while highly novel therapies face severe evidentiary friction. At the same time, the EMA is executing an aggressive, zero-tolerance policy on post-market data integrity, proving that initial approval is no longer a permanent shield. By mapping the disparate decisions from this single session, we can extract the exact risk-benefit framework the CHMP is currently operating under. This requires evaluating these drugs across 2 dimensions. First, the stringency of the regulatory outcome on the y-axis, and second, the therapeutic complexity of the modality on the x-axis. Where a clinical asset lands on this matrix dictates its commercial survival in Europe. We begin on the low-complexity side of our matrix. This chart shows a dense cluster of positive regulatory outcomes for standard modalities. Flu, Hoplido, and Onswick all land squarely in the approval zone. These are prophylactic flu vaccines and targeted treatments for Parkinson's and type 2 diabetes. Because their underlying mechanisms are deeply understood by regulators, the pathway to approval remains highly predictable. This predictability extends to oncology infrastructure. Denosumab, Ascend, and Nilospeg, both biosimilars, easily cleared the threshold, forming a distinct cluster within the positive quadrant. The volume in this low-friction zone is bolstered further by 12 established drugs successfully securing therapeutic indication extensions. Among these, the vaccine Imvanex secured a notable extension for its protective profile against mpox and smallpox. The vaccine specifically targets the poxvirus family, relying on a live modified vaccinia virus to generate an immune response. The CHMP's latest recommendation expands the vaccine's reach significantly, lowering the authorized administration age to individuals 2 years of age and older. For familiar mechanisms of action, the EMA operates as a high-efficiency conveyor belt. Meet the standard clinical trial metrics, and market access is virtually guaranteed. However, a successful application does not mean regulatory scrutiny concludes at commercialization. The most severe action taken during the June session was the recommendation to completely revoke the marketing authorization for the rare inflammatory disease drug Tavneos. Plotting Tavneos on our matrix pulls our data to the absolute floor of the y-axis. The revocation was not triggered by a sudden spike in adverse events, but by new information raising questions about the data integrity of the main study supporting the drug. When foundational clinical data is compromised, the CHMP immediately recalculates the risk-benefit ratio. Without reliable evidence of efficacy, the authorization is voided, regardless of the severity of the targeted conditions. This aggressive auditing extends well into legacy markets, evidenced by the initiation of an Article 31 referral for Rifidin, an established tuberculosis antibiotic. Rifidin occupies the extreme low-complexity end of our chart, but now sits in the precarious review zone. The review was triggered by long-term rodent studies indicating that one of the medicine's excipients, diethylamine, is a possible carcinogen when exposed to very high doses over extended periods. This specific review was forced by the Dutch Medicine Agency, illustrating the power member states hold to mandate pan-European safety audits on decades-old formulations. The CHMP's post-market surveillance is highly proactive. Historical approval provides exactly zero protection against modern data audits or new toxicity findings. Moving to the far right side of the matrix, we find the zone of high therapeutic complexity. This is the domain of advanced, highly engineered modern medicines. This chart shows a distinct cluster of failures in this zone during the June session. Tequel, Yartemlia, and Zerviteg all fell into the negative opinion quadrant. These 3 rejections share a core characteristic. They rely on highly complex, variable mechanisms of action that resist standard statistical validation. Take Tequel. The applicant proposed an autologous, melanoma-derived tumor-infiltrating lymphocyte therapy. While targeting advanced melanoma is an urgent clinical need, ex vivo expanded live cells present massive manufacturing standardization and evidentiary hurdles. The data simply could not cross the CHMP's threshold. We see a similar problem with Cervatec, a pooled allogeneic fecal microbiota treatment. It was designed to treat acute graft versus host disease, an aggressive and life-threatening condition following bone marrow transplants. But proving consistent batch-to-batch clinical efficacy for a biologically pooled, wildly variable product requires clinical trial evidence that is exceptionally difficult to generate. Rounding out this cluster is Yartemlya, which also failed to secure approval for treating complications associated with stem cell transplants. Advanced cellular and microbiome therapies represent the current frontier of clinical science, but regulators are enforcing a rigid, zero-compromise threshold for clinical evidence, a standard these modalities are currently missing. Despite these strict boundaries, the CHMP does not operate in a purely binary manner. The agency possesses pragmatic mechanisms to salvage clinical value when the data allows. Consider the trajectory of DAYBUE. Following an initial refusal, the sponsor engaged the committee in a formal re-examination procedure. The solution was a strategic restriction. Instead of granting approval for the broad disease state of Rett syndrome, the committee recommended authorization exclusively for its neurobehavioral symptoms, matching the data exactly to the claim. A similarly nuanced maneuver occurred with the blockbuster metabolic drug Mounjaro. The sponsor applied for a new, highly valuable indication to explicitly reduce the risk of serious cardiovascular events in adult type 2 diabetes patients. The CHMP evaluated the application and ultimately refused to grant the formal cardiovascular indication, but they engineered a pragmatic compromise. They agreed to include the underlying cardiovascular outcome data directly within Mounjaro's formal product information. This ensures physicians have full visibility into the drug's safety profile and cardiovascular effects, without the agency having to lower its strict legal threshold for a new marketing claim. Looking at this fully populated matrix, the macro-level clustering of the June 2026 session is clear. Approvals stack heavily on the low complexity side, rejections dominate the high complexity frontier, and post-market audits act as a persistent gravitational pull across the board. When we expand this out to the year-to-date data, noting 72 total indication extensions in 2026 alone, it is evident that the overall lifecycle ecosystem in Europe is highly active, but the doorway for net new advanced therapies remains heavily guarded. The structural requirements for evidence in this quadrant are unforgiving. Furthermore, the data integrity requirement is absolute. A commercialized drug like Tavneos can be removed from the market instantly if its foundational trial data is called into question. Securing regulatory success in Europe now demands a perfectly staged clinical trial design right from the very first phase. Sponsors must anticipate friction and know how to utilize restricted indications or data inclusion maneuvers to survive this risk-benefit framework. Developing the science is only the first step. Mastering the agency's strict tolerance for complexity and risk is the true barrier to entry.